Welcome to Marrow Masters Season 10, sponsored by Pharmacyclics & Janssen and Insight. The National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, established in 1992, strives to help patients, caregivers, and families cope with the psychosocial challenges of bone marrow and stem cell transplant from diagnosis through survivorship. Season 10 focuses on sharing hope and inspiration regarding chronic graft versus host disease, or GVHD. This season will cover the importance of clinical trials, find out what survivors wish they and their loved ones had known before, during, and after transplant, and even talk about the unique needs of young adults. Here's your host, Executive Director of the NBMT Link, Peggy Burkhart.
Welcome, everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Barbara Abernathy, President and CEO of the Pediatric Oncology Support Team, also known as POST, a nonprofit that serves children with cancer and their families living in 6 South Florida counties. Barb is also a survivor who knows all too well about GVHD and the toll it takes. Hello, Barb. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Peggy. I'm excited to be here.
So let's start with your story before we talk about your GVHD.
Yeah, in 1996, I was diagnosed with Polycythemia Vera. It's a really big word for a serious blood cancer. And from that point, my life changed forever. I was on a variety of different treatments, from anagrelide to interferon, hydroxyurea, and PEG-Intron. But one of the things that was most alarming for me was that my dad had died of CML when I was in college, and his mother had died of AML. So it just was really disconcerting to be diagnosed with a blood cancer, knowing that it ran so strong in my family. In fact, my doctor told me, well, your grandmother was in her 70s when she got leukemia and died. Your father was in his 50s when he got leukemia and died. You do the math.
Oh, wow. And how old were you, Barb?
32.
Oh.
So he basically said, write your will, say your goodbyes. But I just knew that wasn't going to be my story.
Good for you. So what happened next?
Yeah, I went on for quite a while with those treatments and just trying to keep life as normal as possible. I had, by that point, started working at Post. I was helping families who had a child with cancer, but keeping my story to myself, really keeping that very separate from what I did every day, and just kind of walking through all of the burden of the symptoms that one has to deal with when you're going through a serious blood cancer. But, the world can be somewhat unforgiving, and workplaces don't like to know that their employees are dealing with illness. So it's definitely something that a lot of us have to face on a daily basis. And then in 2013, I had started with a whole variety of other symptoms, like bone pain and night sweats, low-grade fevers every night, and just not feeling well at all, and had a bone marrow biopsy. And the oncologist at Mayo Clinic said, how quickly can you get out here? Your disease has changed lanes. We're now looking at AML, and you're going to need a bone marrow transplant urgently. And again, another time my life changed forever.
Absolutely. Oh, so tell us about your experience, your match. How did that go?
So because of my family history, the only sibling that they tested was my younger sister, and she was not a match, which was a really hard experience for her. But they didn't test any of my older siblings at all because of not wanting to replant a mutation and create future problems. So, my DNA was put into the registry, and fortunately there was a match with a young man in Germany. I didn't know that at the time that he was a young man. I didn't know he was in Europe. I just knew that there was somebody out there who could potentially save my life, and had raised his hand to say, I can help and I will help.
Oh, that's awesome. Have you gotten to meet him?
I have not gotten to meet him. We emailed back and forth. He's a very humble young man who feels like, why are you thanking me for something that I would have done anyway? Like he doesn't want all the fanfare and attention. He just feels like it was the right thing to do, and he shouldn't be celebrated for it.
Oh, sounds like a special person.
Oh, yeah.
Barb, for a minute, let's talk about Post. Let's talk about your work. This is so exciting.
Yeah. It just has kind of where I was meant to be, because my life experience and my professional experience have really dovetailed together. And at this point, yeah, I do share about my journey with my patients. And I think that in a way, it connects them so that they know that I understand what they're going through. When I tell them, hey, I get it, then they believe me. So it's coming from a place of experience. It's coming from a place of knowing and a place of having been there. And I think for all of us, when we know that somebody's been in our shoes, it creates a real strong bond.
Oh, talk about walking the walk and talking the talk.
Yeah.
Just a perfect role for you. So before your transplant, knowing, that you're in this field already with the youngsters, what were your expectations regarding graft versus host disease?
Well, I mean, unlike most BMT patients, I walked in kind of eyes wide open in terms of graft versus host. And I had seen some patients have some really serious outcomes with GVH. So I was very mindful when I was trying to find the right transplant center and transplant doctor, and asked a lot of GVH questions. And I think the doctors were like, who is this lady? And like, what kind of internet research did she do? But I was more afraid of graft versus host after the transplant than I was of dying from the transplant.
Wow.
So I felt it was really important to partner with a doctor and a facility that did a lot of research in graft versus host and really took it seriously.
And where was that you ended up going?
Yeah, so I ended up having my transplant at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida.
Terrific. Let's talk about acute GVHD versus chronic. What was your experience there?
My first round of acute GVHD was with my eyes and also my GI system, my skin, and liver.
Tell me more about that. What was the most challenging, and did it stop there, or did it just roll right into chronic?
I mean, there were all of it was challenging in its own way. Like my eyes, they just wept all the time. I couldn't see because my eyes were just blurry from just watery. I kept telling them there's something wrong with my eyes. And then the GI, just the massive amounts of diarrhea and nausea and vomiting for 2 months, nonstop. I lost 60 pounds because of that. So acute graft versus host is something that doesn't really get talked about enough, but it is really debilitating. But after that, the acute rolled right into the chronic. For me, there was really was no grace period at all. It was just kind of one thing right into the other.
And was it the same organs affected as you rolled into the chronic, or did it change up?
Definitely the same ones stayed with me, and then a few more were added.
Oh, great.
A few more skin issues, some lichen planus and lichen sclerosis. I also got dry mouth in addition to all the other plethora of symptoms, and alopecia. So, my hair hasn't grown back because of graft versus host. So I was hopeful that once the graft versus host got a little more under control, that might start to happen. Because people see me and they make an assumption that I'm still in treatment, and I'm constantly fielding questions about that.
Sure.
Not having hair is its own kind of challenge. And then really not being able to sweat. Living in South Florida, dogs don't sweat. And they have to sort of find other ways to get cool. And for me, it's the same. I can get really overheated really quickly. So it can become life-threatening just, being outside having a picnic on a normal day.
I'm sure you have to watch out for the sun too.
Yeah.
As comforting as it can be. I know our graft versus host disease patients really struggle with that.
Yes, as much as all the vitamin D from the sun is your friend, it really can trigger a whole host of other skin and eye issues.
Oh boy. So we're going to get to the hopeful part in a little bit here, Barb.
Absolutely.
But you are really laying the groundwork, the reality of what all of this entails, and we really appreciate it. So let's talk about the treatment that you're receiving.
So when I was in transplant, I had, of course, massive doses of prednisone and tacrolimus, sirolimus, ofatumumab, uscondubinab. MMF. And then once I got out of transplant, we tried to sort of peel back on a few of those. So by the time I got out of transplant, I was just doing the prednisone, tacrolimus, sirolimus, and MMF. And, as things progress, doctors want to get you off of those immune suppressant medications because they want you to be able to live as normally as possible.
Sure.
And being on, some really heavy hitting immune suppressants means changing the way that you live and changing, especially during a pandemic or, working in a hospital setting. So there's fortunately been a lot of improvements and new things that have come along to really be helpful. So I was on Rezurock, Jakafi, beclomethasone. I've been on budesonide, Ursidile, all kinds of topical creams and ointments, multiple types of eye drops, minoxidil for the alopecia. I've been on IVIG and also extracorporeal photophoresis, which you should get a PhD just for learning how to say that.
Absolutely.
It's where you're sitting in a chair for 4 hours and a machine takes your blood out and treats it through an ultraviolet light to try to make the B cells less reactive.
Okay.
And that's like 2 days a week for a year. Some of these treatments make you not feel so good. Some are less toxic than others. But, everyone that you start, you go into it with a whole lot of hope that this is going to be the one that makes the difference, the one that turns the tide.
Sure. We're one of the other episodes that we're going to have in this series is about clinical trials. And it's so interesting. So many of the drugs you're talking about, Barb, were not around 5 years, 6 years ago, and they are making a big difference. And you are the perfect person to ask and see that progress firsthand, that things have gotten better. Future patients will hopefully have an easier go of it because of the clinical trials that result in better drugs. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I think that's so true. And just, my 25 years also in working with pediatric patients, seeing them go through transplant, the level of graft versus host that these kids come out with now is, astonishingly low compared to what I saw over the past 25 years. Like they're coming out and within a year being able to get off meds, live their lives, go back and be on the baseball team, or there's one girl who is going back to lifeguarding. It's life-changing. And I think that the hope is there.
Sure.
There are people working on this, really smart people working in new ways, looking at how the body responds and not just using the same old techniques, but really taking new research and turning it on its ear to come up with very different kinds of treatments.
I'm so glad you touched on that, Barb, because when you think of the youngsters, the young people, we actually have another episode that Dr. Harris from Memorial Sloan Kettering is going to talk about the effect of GVHD on children. And this really complements everything that he said. And you have that expertise with the children. So I really do appreciate you touching on that. So Barb, let's talk about the side effects that resulted from your graft versus host disease.
I would say that, one of the ones that is most impactful is just being continuously immune compromised. And I'm a scuba instructor. And for 5 years, I couldn't get in the water and go scuba diving or swim with manatees. So that was huge. But it's even small things like you can't have a medium cooked steak or hamburger. I couldn't have a salad or eat a salad in a restaurant. It's just, a crazy number of kinds of restrictions. But, fevers, fatigue, low blood counts, frequent nausea, and then the time away from work that you just don't feel well. And the time away from family and away from socializing, because when you're done with work, you just don't have the energy to really go out to dinner with somebody. So your social life suffers. And once you've said, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm just not up to it right now, 2 or 3 times, people think, oh, I got the hint, and they stop asking. And that's really not what you want them to do. You want them to keep asking. It's just that there are days where you just cannot push through and you can't get off the couch to go out and eat dinner with somebody no matter how much you want to.
I love your honesty. And, just for everyone listening, to realize it's not about you when someone says no to your dinner invitation. Maybe a Saturday morning breakfast invitation might be a great idea. It's really having that communication with the people you love and who love you so that there's no hard feelings. It's the truth. It's the reality. So I'm glad we talked about that.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, because earlier in the day, for me, that would be a much better ask. Or let me come over and let's just watch a video, something that's not going to take a lot of effort. I don't have to dress up for, I don't have to worry about, keeping up a conversation. So yes, I think if I were able to explain to somebody what my limitations are and then say, let's have a conversation about what it can look like instead of what it can't look like.
Oh, for sure. We had a gentleman who explained his GVHD as the beginning of the day, he started with a charged battery, like a cell phone that was fully charged. But by dinner time, he knew he was going to be out of juice. He was going to be at zero with no chance to recharge that night. And when he explained that on one of our lunch and learns, it was so crystal clear that, earlier in the day, or I'm sure you have to do this sometimes, conserve your energy for something that you absolutely have to attend in the evening. And just knowing that and knowing your limits.
Exactly right. It's so true. And sometimes your battery is kind of burnt out by 1:00 in the afternoon. And
understandable.
But I think in terms of, relationships and just being social, one of the things that it's hard to find time for is housekeeping. So there have been times where I was just embarrassed to have anybody over to my house. And so friends were like thinking that I didn't want them over. And it really wasn't that. It just was that, I was embarrassed about what I couldn't keep up with and just sort of needing them to understand.
Barb, that's amazing when you think about it. I love how we're touching on the communication for loved ones that are trying to also, let's face it, they're dealing with your graft versus host disease also because they love you. I was listening to a podcast the other day where a woman was talking about people that draw near. They don't wait and ask what they can do. They really show up. And I think that's really important for us all to remember in life. Just draw near and show up.
There are people who show up and then there are people who hang back. And not everybody who hangs back doesn't want to help. It's just that they don't know how to help or they're waiting to be asked. And sometimes as a person who's just managing to get through the day, I can't formulate like what I need for Susan to do for me. And even then, I had a mom recently whose 23-year-old son was going through a transplant out of state. So someone here was taking care of their dog while they were gone. And that person had a hard deadline where she needed to go out of town. And so this mom called another friend of hers and said, listen, I need you to take care of Scooter for a few days while, Bethany is out of town. And the woman said, well, I said I would help, but that's not helping. How is that helping? Taking care of the dog? She goes, I didn't mean taking care of the dog. I meant like cooking food for your family or driving, your son to an appointment. And this mom was so crushed because she's like, but those weren't the things I needed.
Sure.
What I needed was somebody to take care of Scooter.
Absolutely. Oh, well, I hope Scooter got taken care of.
Scooter did. Scooter's fine.
Scooter's good. Okay. Yep. So Barb, looking back, because you have been through it all, is there something you wished you had known before transplant regarding GVHD or anything?
One of the things that the team tells you is that they have no idea how GVHD is going to affect you as a person. And even my own transplant doctor, whom I adore, says that he tells his students, when you've done one transplant, you've done one transplant.
I like that.
So yeah, nobody can tell you what it's going to look like for you. And there's so many different kinds, the skin and the GI and all those things. But even if you have one of those, you don't know how it's going to manifest for you. There's no crystal ball. And it also changes and presents differently, 2 years out, 5 years out, 7 years out. And I've met people who didn't have any graft versus host. And then 15 years later, suddenly they started with graft versus host. I guess I wish that I had known that my hair would not grow back so that I wouldn't have spent so much time focusing on my hair.
Okay.
I wish that I had known that GVHD could last a lifetime, because I think I would have just been a little bit more chill about it, instead of like being so vigilant about when is it going to go away and waiting for it to go away. And I missed out on part of my life by waiting.
Okay. Yeah. That's very honest. I like that. Well, I think you look beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.
Barb, are there any tips or suggestions that you have for other newbies, patients, caregivers today?
Several. Educate yourself as much as you can and as much as you can tolerate. There's a lot of resources out there. Make sure that they are reliable and legitimate online resources, and then create a powerful support system for yourself, family, friends, but also other transplant survivors, and your healthcare providers are part of your team too. Like, they work for you, you know?
Sure.
My folks are on team Barb. I'm not on team Dr. Fernandez. No. So finding a healthcare provider that you can actually partner with, who actually listens to you. With Dr. Fernandez, you know, he and I talked about scuba diving, and I'm sure he got so tired of me talking about scuba diving, but he knew how important that was. So we found some workarounds until finally, you know, 5 years later, I was able to get in the water. And it's not something I can do all the time, but he wants me to find those times of joy for me.
Mm-hmm.
And joy looks different for everybody. So communicating with your team about what joy looks like for you so that they can find those workarounds for you. But you're also going to have to advocate for yourself with your work, your supervisor, educating them on, you know, unfortunately knowing what your rights are. And a lot of businesses, when something first happens and all this comes out, they're like, take whatever time you need, do whatever you need. We got you. We're here for you. But then, you know, you're a couple years in and their patience is wearing thin, and, you know, they can't be giving you as much time off. So it's really important to know how to have ongoing conversations, knowing that you know your body best, because when you go in for follow-up appointments at the transplant center and in your mind, you're thinking, wow, this stiffness in my shoulder, was it just that I did, you know, too much on weight day, or is this a sign of graft versus host? Like, ask the question. These are your experts. They're your team, you know?
Yeah.
Just ask them, and rest when you need to, not when it's convenient for everybody else. While at the same time staying as active as you can. You want to move your body. You know, a person in motion stays in motion.
Mm-hmm.
And give yourself permission for the feelings that you have about GVHD, about your body and your life, because if it changes your body in ways that are going to be permanent, finding some way to embrace that, finding some way to find some love in that, and then creatively expressing yourself. There are definitely writing groups out there and art groups and ways that people can find new ways of expressing themselves. Sometimes words are not the best way that we have to share the experience of what we're going through. Sometimes it means, you know, showing somebody through some artwork or a poem that you've written that can really speak powerfully to what you're really going through.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. Wow, we've covered a lot. As we wrap things up here, is there anything else that you want to add? You are my hero. I know you've had a long road, and we're so appreciative of you sharing all of your knowledge between your profession and your personal experience. Any final words?
First, I just want to thank you for doing this, because, you know, graft versus host is a really lonely disease.
Mm-hmm.
And once you've been through a bone marrow or stem cell transplant, the one question that people ask you is, are you in remission? And if the answer is yes, they don't ask anything else. Nobody understands what graft versus host is. Most physicians who are not in the field do not understand what it is. So to have you out there, like answering those questions that haven't even been asked yet, like is beautiful, and putting it into the world so that people who are going through this don't feel like they have to go through it alone.
Oh, thank you.
And then, being kind to yourself. If it's a hard day, it's a hard day.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot change that it's a hard day, but you can change your expectations of yourself. And even though maybe you made plans for tonight and by 4:00, your battery is all run down, you're just going to have to be able to be honest. And I mean, if you think you can go home and lay down for 2 hours and recharge, and being honest with your friend about, could we push it back to 7 instead of 6 so that I have time to recharge my batteries, and I'd still like to see you. But the other thing is just remembering that you're not alone, that there's a lot of us out here. We're walking the same path. It may look a little bit different for each one of us, but we got to lean on each other.
I'm so glad you said that, Barb. I also want to add that at the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, we have a peer support program where we will buddy people up with, someone that's maybe a little ahead of them on their journey. And this has been a really important program for connecting folks. We had one gentleman who had 5 peers. He was the caregiver. He lived in a rural area, and he said, I don't know what I would have done without your peer support program, because I had a peer for every part of this puzzle that my wife and I were going through.
Wow.
So you're not alone, and we are so happy to help you out. I'll put it in the show notes, but you can reach out to us, info@nbmtlink.org anytime, and we'll be happy to find a friend. But these podcasts, I think, are also a way for people to connect with others just by listening.
Very much. I can't tell you how much it helps to know that somebody is out there shining a light on this right now, because GVHD is like a game of whack-a-mole.
Mm-hmm.
And so some days are harder than others, and walking through it can take a toll. Sometimes it just feels like, walking through quicksand, and all it takes is for one person to reach out to you and lift you up. And if we're educating the people around those people to do that and to hold them in a way that supports them, there's no greater love than that.
Well, Barb, I can't even think of anything to say to follow that, because that was just so beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today with us.
My pleasure.
This has been the Marrow Masters podcast. If you know someone who would benefit from the information in our show, please share this episode with them. And don't miss future episodes of our show. Follow Marrow Masters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now. And to connect with the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, visit nbmtlink.org or follow the link in our show notes.